5 alien captains mocked Earth. They thought Earth was defeated. Moments later, human fleet arrived. The sky above Earth was full of broken metal. Pieces of old satellites and dead warships turned slowly in the black, catching the weak light of the sun. Down below, the cities were dark. Power grids had failed in most regions. Only a few lights blinked from underground bunkers, like small stars refusing to die. It had been 40 days since the alien fleets came. They called themselves the Coth Dominion, and they had crossed the stars in 5 great motherships, each one commanded by a captain, who believed they were about to make history. Their commanders had studied Earth for over a decade through hidden probes. They knew about human wars, human politics, human weakness. They believed humanity was a species that could talk a great deal, but could not truly fight when the moment came. The first attack had been swift. Human orbital defense stations, built over 60 years of careful engineering, were gone within the first 6 hours. The Coth ships were faster, their shields stronger, their weapons more advanced by at least 2 centuries of technology. Earth's finest generals had watched on their screens as one station after another turned to fire and silence. By the 10th day, 3 continents had gone dark. By the 20th day, the last of Earth's visible battle fleet, a group of 40 ships called the Atlas Guard, had been destroyed near the orbit of the moon. It was the last real resistance anyone on the enemy side had seen. After that, there was nothing. No signals, no ships, no fight. The Coth Dominion believed the war was over. Now, 5 motherships hung in a loose circle above the Pacific Ocean, so massive that from the ground they looked like new moons. Inside the flagship, named the Devourer of Light, a meeting was about to begin. It was a meeting the 5 captains had been looking forward to for weeks. It was the celebration meeting, the victory meeting. Captain Threx Valor of the Devourer of Light sat at the head of a long obsidian table shaped like a curved blade. He was a tall being, nearly 8 feet, with gray-blue skin and eyes that glowed faintly amber in dim light. He wore heavy dark armor decorated with the medals of 40 conquered worlds. Earth would be the 41st, and by far the easiest. Around the table, holographic images flickered to life, showing the other 4 captains from their own ships. The first to appear was Captain Sorenth Ka, commander of the Iron Verdict, a squat and powerfully built alien, with 3 eyes arranged in a triangle on his face. He laughed before he even finished speaking a greeting. "Threx," he said, his voice a deep grinding sound. "I have been waiting for this call all week. Tell me the numbers are as good as the rumors." "Better," Threx said, allowing himself the faintest smile. "Human resistance, based on our scans, has fallen to less than 2% of what it was on day 1. Their command centers are silent. Their so-called capital cities send us only static. We believe their government has fully collapsed." The second hologram flickered in. Captain Ulara Thess of the Silent Reaper, a slender alien with pale skin and long fingers that moved constantly, as if she were always calculating something in her head. She did not laugh like Sorenth. She simply nodded slowly, satisfied. "I told my crew a month ago this would not take long," she said. "Humans are loud before a fight and quiet after one. It seems I was right again." The third hologram showed Captain Dorun Kez of the Black Tide, a heavy-set alien whose face was covered in ritual battle scars, each one representing an enemy fleet he had personally destroyed in his 300 years of service. He crossed his thick arms. "I still say we should not have wasted so much time being careful," Dorun grumbled. "We treated this primitive species like they were dangerous. Look at them now, hiding in holes in the ground like insects." The fourth hologram was the strangest of the 5, Captain Vexilon Moth, commander of the Hollow Choir, a being whose face was hidden completely behind a smooth silver mask, and whose voice came out modulated and calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening than the others. "They fought well for a young species," Vexilon said softly. "It is only fair to admit that. But young things break easily. That is the nature of youth." Threx Valor raised a hand, and the 4 holograms quieted. "We gather today not simply to boast," he said, "though I admit, we have earned the right to boast a little." A few of the captains chuckled. "We gather to finalize the terms of division, Earth's remaining resources, its surviving population centers, its territory. All of this must be divided fairly among our 5 houses, as agreed before we left Cath space." A large star map appeared above the table, showing the blue and green planet turning slowly, its surface marked with red zones, showing destroyed cities, and gray zones, showing captured territory. Green zones, the last untouched regions, were few and shrinking by the hour on the display. The northern human territories, what they called Europe and North America, will go to House Valinor and House Ka, Threx said, gesturing at the map. The southern territories, once called South America and Africa, to House Thes and House Kez. The eastern regions, Asia, to House Moth, given your fleet's position there already. Generous of you to save the largest slice for yourself, Sorenth said, though there was no real anger in his voice. It was the kind of joke old comrades made with each other. Someone has to lead, Threx replied smoothly, and leading means taking the greater burden of governing these creatures once they are fully broken. Doruan snorted, governing them, as if they will need much governing. A conquered species like this, with their spirit crushed, usually just needs food and fear to keep them quiet. I have seen it 100 times on other worlds. They are more stubborn than most, Ulara said, tapping one long finger against the table. My scanners still pick up scattered radio chatter, encrypted of course, moving between what looks like hidden shelters, small groups, nothing organized, but stubborn. Let them whisper in their holes, Threx said. A whisper is not an army. We destroyed their fleet. We destroyed their satellites. We destroyed their command centers. What exactly do they have left to fight with? Sharp sticks and anger? This drew a real laugh from the table, even from the masked Vexilon, whose modulated chuckle sounded strange and hollow through the masked speaker. I heard, Sorenth said, leaning forward with interest, that some of my officers picked up a strange broadcast 2 days ago. Some human leader, giving a speech, something about how humanity would rise again. Very dramatic, very human. He rolled all 3 of his eyes. They do love their speeches. What did it say exactly? Vexilon asked, tilting his masked head slightly. Sorenth waved a hand. The usual. We will not surrender. We will fight until our last breath. Freedom will return. That sort of thing. My translator officer said it was almost poetic, in its own primitive way. A pity such passion is wasted on a losing cause. Humans are a species built on emotion rather than logic, Ulara said. That is precisely why they lost so quickly, despite their occasional cleverness. A logical species prepares before the war begins. Humans prepared during the war, after it had already started. By the time their engineers understood what we were already in orbit. Threx nodded slowly, his amber eyes glowing a little brighter with something like satisfaction. That has always been the flaw of young, disorganized worlds. They fight each other more than they prepare for an outside threat. Earth spent its energy on hundreds of separate nations, each one distrustful of the others, each one slow to unite, even when the danger was clear. By the time they formed anything like a real alliance, we had already broken their orbital shield. A fitting lesson for any species, Doruan said. Unity comes too late, or not at all. The meeting continued in this manner for some time, the 5 captains trading reports, numbers, boasts, and casual insults toward the defeated planet below them. To them, this was simply the final formality before true conquest began. The counting of spoils, the division of territory, the beginning of a new colony that would, in a generation or 2, forget it had ever been called Earth by the strange, short-lived creatures who once lived there. But far below, in a place none of the 5 captains' scanners had ever managed to fully map, something else was happening. 12 kilometers beneath the surface of what used to be called Nevada, in a facility carved directly into ancient bedrock, human engineers moved through corridors lit by soft blue emergency lighting. This was Bastion Deep, one of 17 hidden production sites built not in the weeks after the invasion began, but in the 2 years before it, ever since a joint team of scientists and generals had picked up faint, unexplainable signals from deep space that no one in the public ever learned about. Earth's governments had not been foolish, whatever the alien captains believed. Long before the Coth Dominion arrived, a small group of leaders across nations, too many to count, had quietly agreed on one simple truth. If the stars ever sent something hostile toward Earth, humanity's greatest weakness would not be a lack of courage, it would be division. So, in secret, working through channels hidden from public eye, and even from most of their own governments, they built something new. Not a single nation's fleet, not a single company's project. A joint human fleet, built with shared technology, shared resources, and shared purpose, hidden deep underground and far out in the solar system, where no probe, however advanced, had thought to look. When the Coth Dominion arrived and began its assault, the visible fleets of Earth, the Atlas Guard and dozens of national defense forces, fought and died exactly as the enemy captains had seen. This had not been an accident. It had been, in the coldest and most painful sense, a plan. Every visible ship destroyed, every visible city darkened, every visible resistance crushed, had bought something precious. Time. Time for the enemy to grow confident. Time for the enemy to grow careless. Time for the true fleet, hidden beneath oceans and inside asteroid belts and behind the far side of the moon, to finish what it needed to finish. In Bastion Deep, a woman named Admiral Elena Cho stood before a massive display showing the current positions of the 5 alien motherships, calmly circling above the Pacific, like vultures certain their prey was already dead. Around her, dozens of officers moved between stations, their faces tired but steady, the look of people who had trained for this exact moment for 2 long years. "Confirmed positions locked," said a young officer at the tracking station. All 5 Cath command ships, holding formation above grid 7-2 Alpha. No signs of dispersal. "Good," Elena said quietly. "They are exactly where we need them. Together. Comfortable. Not expecting anything." Beside her stood General Marcus Webb, a broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw from the very first week of the invasion, when he had barely escaped the destruction of a command bunker in what used to be Washington. He had not smiled in 40 days. He allowed himself the smallest one now. 2 years of building in secret, he said. 2 years of watching our own cities burn on the surface, without being able to help, because helping would have meant revealing what we were building down here. I will never forget the faces of the people who didn't understand why we didn't send everything we had. "They will understand soon," Elena said. "Everyone will understand soon." On the main display, a new set of numbers began counting upward, not a countdown to 0, but a count of readiness, ship by ship, fleet by fleet, checking in from positions scattered across the solar system. Ships hidden in the shadow of Jupiter's moons, ships resting silently on the far side of Mars, ships buried under kilometers of ice on Europa, powered down to nearly nothing so as not to be detected, ships hidden even closer than the enemy could imagine, tucked beneath the waves of Earth's own oceans, in specially built underwater hangars. All of them, all at once, were waking up. "Signal from the Council," said a communications officer, her voice tight with focus. "Final authorization received. All fleet elements report full readiness in approximately 11 minutes. Elena Cho looked at the calm, arrogant faces of the 5 alien captains, still displayed on a secondary screen, still talking, still laughing, still dividing up a planet they believed was already theirs. She thought of the cities destroyed to buy this moment. She thought of the soldiers of the Atlas Guard who had fought and died in the first days, not knowing they were part of a larger plan, only knowing they had to hold the line as long as they could. She thought of every family hiding in the dark, waiting for a sign that humanity was not finished. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "Let them enjoy this meeting. It will be the last one they ever have." General Webb nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the display. "How long until the fleet reaches optimal firing position?" 10 minutes, Elena said. 10 minutes, and 5 very confident captains are going to learn exactly how wrong they were. Above the Pacific Ocean, inside the Devourer of Light, the 5 holograms continued their meeting, unaware that far beneath the waves, and far across the black distances of space, thousands of human ships were beginning to move, silent, patient, and finally, after 2 long years of waiting, ready. Captain Threx Valor raised a glass of dark liquid in a mock toast, and the other 4 captains did the same on their own ships, their images lifting glasses that would never truly touch across the light years between them. "To the fall of Earth," Threx said, "and to the beginning of a new age for the Coth Dominion." "To the fall of Earth," the others repeated, laughter echoing through 5 separate command decks. None of them noticed the faint disturbance rippling across their outer sensor range, small and easy to dismiss as background noise from the planet's own magnetic field. None of them noticed the shape of something enormous beginning to rise from beneath the waves of the ocean below. None of them noticed, because none of them were looking for it. To understand how confident the 5 captains had become, it helps to look back at the 40 days that came before this meeting, because confidence like theirs is never built in a single moment. It is built slowly, day after day, through reports that all say the same comforting thing. On the first day of the invasion, 5 motherships had dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system, their arrival detected by every observatory on Earth within minutes. Governments that had spent decades arguing over trade agreements and border disputes suddenly found themselves staring at the same terrifying images on their screens. For a brief, chaotic period, humanity had done what humanity often did in the face of disaster: argued about what to do next. The Coth Dominion had not waited for that argument to finish. Their scout ships swept through Earth's outer defense network first, disabling long-range sensors and communication relays with brutal efficiency. Then came the destruction of the orbital stations, followed by a methodical campaign against visible military assets on the ground. Every step of the invasion had been recorded, studied, and reported back to the 5 captains in careful detail, and every report told the same story. Humanity was falling apart exactly as expected. What the reports could not show, because the reports were built entirely from what the Coth sensors were allowed to see, was the second story running underneath the first one. While national governments argued in public, and military commanders gave orders that would be broadcast, recorded, and eventually intercepted by enemy scanners, a much smaller and much quieter group of people had already begun moving pieces into place that no report would ever capture. This group did not have a formal name at first. Later, once the war was over, historians would call it simply the Continuity Council, a name chosen for its plainness rather than for any sense of grandeur. It consisted of a rotating group of scientists, generals, engineers, and a handful of political leaders who had been read into a program most of their own governments did not fully understand. The program had begun 2 years before the invasion, after a joint research station on the far side of the moon had detected faint, unexplainable signals that no known human technology could produce. At first, the signals were dismissed as instrument error. Then, as they persisted and grew slightly stronger over several months, a small international team was quietly assembled to investigate. What they found was not proof of an invasion, not exactly, but something close enough to prove unsettling. Evidence that something intelligent, technologically far beyond humanity, had passed through the outer solar system at some point in the last decade, likely on a scouting mission of its own. The Continuity Council's founding members had faced a choice that would define the next 2 years of human history. They could report their findings publicly, triggering panic, political posturing, and almost certainly the kind of fractured, competing response that had doomed other moments in human history, when unity was needed most. Or they could act quietly, pooling resources across willing nations, building something that could survive contact with a threat no single country could face alone. They chose the second path, and it had not been easy. There had been leaks that needed containing, funding gaps that nearly ended the project twice, and constant, exhausting negotiation between nations that had spent generations distrusting one another. More than once, the entire program had nearly collapsed under the weight of old rivalries. It was only the shared, growing certainty that something was coming, and coming soon, that kept enough leaders at the table long enough to finish what they had started. None of this history was visible to the 5 captains circling above the Pacific. All they saw was a planet that had fought hard in its visible military engagements and then gone quiet, exactly the pattern their intelligence had predicted for a young, disorganized species facing overwhelming force. They had no reason to imagine a second fleet, because nothing in their experience with 40 previous conquests had ever prepared them for a species patient enough and united enough to hide one. They believed the war was already over. They were about to learn how wrong they were. On the bridge of the Iron Verdict, Captain Sorenth Ka leaned back in his command chair, still smiling from the toast, when one of his sensor officers, a smaller alien named Pris, made a small sound of confusion. "Captain," Pris said, "I am seeing something strange on the deep sensors." Sorenth did not even turn his head, define strange. "A ripple," Pris said, "very faint, coming from beneath the ocean surface, directly below our position. It could be seismic activity. This planet still has active fault lines in this region." "Then log it as seismic activity, and stop bothering me during a council meeting," Sorenth said, waving a thick hand. Pris hesitated, glancing at the readout again. The ripple did not look like an earthquake. Earthquakes did not have a rhythm to them, a pattern that repeated every few seconds, almost like something breathing, or something powering up. But Pris was young, only in his 3rd year of service, and he did not want to be the officer who interrupted a victory meeting between 5 captains over what was probably nothing. He logged it as seismic activity, just as he was told, and said nothing more. He would think about that moment for the rest of his life, however short it turned out to be. Back at the council table, the conversation had moved from division of territory to smaller matters. Supply routes, prisoner processing, the timeline for bringing down colony ships to begin real settlement. Darun Kez was in the middle of a long complaint about the quality of Earth's remaining industrial equipment when Yulara Thess suddenly went very still, her long fingers freezing mid-motion above the table. "Yulara?" Threx asked, noticing. "One moment," she said, her pale face turning toward something off-screen, something only she could see on her own ship's displays. A long few seconds passed. "My sensor array is reporting several dozen small contacts near the edge of the solar system, past the orbit of what the humans call Mars." "Debris," Darun said immediately. "There is a great deal of old wreckage floating out there. Human probes, dead satellites, asteroid mining equipment they abandoned decades ago. It happens every few days. Your officers are jumping at shadows." "Perhaps," Yulara said slowly, though she did not sound entirely convinced. "The contacts are moving in an unusual pattern, though, too organized for random debris. Run a deeper scan if it troubles you," Threx said, though there was a slight edge of impatience in his voice now. He did not want this meeting, the meeting he had looked forward to for weeks, interrupted by false alarms. "But I would remind everyone, we swept this system thoroughly before the invasion began. We know what is out there. Old machines, empty ships, nothing more." Yulara nodded and turned her attention back to the table, though a small part of her mind stayed on the strange contacts near Mars, filing the information away, the way a careful predator remembers every unusual sound in the grass, even the ones that turn out to be nothing. The meeting continued. Far beneath the Pacific Ocean, in a chamber the size of a small mountain carved out of solid rock beneath the seabed, massive doors made of reinforced alloy began to slide open. Water rushed through channels designed specifically to let it pass without damaging what lay inside, and what lay inside began, slowly and silently, to rise. The human fleet had not been built the way the Coth Dominion built their ships. The Coth favored size and raw power, ships built to intimidate as much as to fight, covered in weapons that could be seen from a great distance, meant to make an enemy feel small and afraid before a single shot was fired. Human engineers, working with the small amount of alien technology recovered from a scout ship shot down in the first hours of the invasion, along with 60 years of their own research into physics that had never been made public, had built something different. They had built ships meant to be quiet. The lead vessel of the Deep Fleet was called the Resolute, and it did not look like much from the outside. Long and narrow, dark gray, with none of the aggressive spikes or glowing weapon ports that decorated Coth warships. But inside its hull was a power core built on principles the Coth Dominion did not yet understand, a design based on captured technology that human scientists had improved upon in ways the original alien engineers had never imagined, because human engineers had a habit of taking things apart to see how they worked, and then building something better. On the Resolute's bridge, Fleet Commander James Okafor watched the ocean water part above his ship's ascent path on the main view screen. Beside him, a younger officer named Lieutenant Sarah Voss checked the final systems. "All primary weapons at full charge," she reported. "Shield generators nominal. Cloaking field holding steady, at 98% efficiency." 98 is enough, Okafor said. "We are not trying to stay hidden forever, just long enough." He had been a young captain in the Atlas Guard, one of the few who had survived the destruction of that fleet near the moon, pulled out at the last moment by an escape pod, and brought into the secret program 2 weeks later, when the surviving military leadership realized his tactical instincts were too valuable to lose. He remembered watching, through the small window of his escape pod, as Coth warships tore through ship after ship of his old fleet, brave crews, who had no idea they were fighting a battle they were never meant to win, only meant to survive long enough to make the enemy believe humanity's fight was already finished. He had asked, once, Why the Atlas Guard had not been told about the secret fleet. Why they had been sent to die, without knowing there was a larger plan. Admiral Cho had answered him honestly, which he had respected, even as the answer had been hard to hear. Because they needed to fight like it was the only fleet Earth had, she had said. A soldier who believes reinforcements are coming fights differently than one who believes he is the last line of defense. We needed the enemy to see real desperation, real defeat. Actors cannot fake that convincingly enough. Only truth can. It had taken Okafor a long time to make peace with that answer. He was not sure he had fully made peace with it even now, but he understood it, and understanding was enough to keep him moving forward, especially today, especially now, when the moment the Atlas Guard had unknowingly bought with their lives was finally about to be spent. Status of the rest of the Deep Fleet? He asked. All underwater hangars reporting successful launch, Voss said. 240 ships from the Pacific facility alone. Combined with the fleets emerging from the outer solar system positions, total combat strength moving toward rendezvous point is... She paused, checking the number twice before saying it aloud. 3,112 vessels. Okafor allowed himself a small, tired smile. 3,000 ships. 2 years ago, when the program had begun in earnest, they had hoped for perhaps a tenth of that number, built quietly, using shared resources scraped together from nations who had finally, truly, for the first time in human history, decided to work as one species instead of hundreds of competing countries. It had not been easy. There had been arguments, disagreements, moments when it seemed the whole secret alliance might fall apart under the weight of old rivalries and mistrust. But the threat from the stars had done something no war between humans had ever managed to do. It had reminded every nation on Earth that they were, in the end, the same fragile species, standing on the same fragile planet, and that fragile things survived only by standing together. Rendezvous point in 6 minutes, Voss reported. Outer system fleets are matching our approach vector. Formation Sunrise will be complete on schedule. Formation Sunrise, Okafor repeated quietly, looking at the tactical display where thousands of small green markers were converging from every direction toward the 5 red markers hovering above the Pacific. Fitting name. Back on the Devourer of Light, the meeting had finally turned toward the topic of celebration. Captain Threx Valor called for a proper toast, a real one this time, with ceremonial drink brought out by his aides in polished metal cups. The other 4 captains, still connected by hologram, raised their own cups in turn, and for a moment, the mood in 5 separate command centers was one of pure, unguarded triumph. 41 worlds, Threx said, lifting his cup high. 41 worlds brought under the Dominion's banner, and this one, taken with barely a scratch on our hulls. I will admit, when the Council first proposed sending 5 full command fleets to conquer a single primitive world, I thought it was excessive. Overkill, even for a cautious species like ours. And now? Sorenth asked, grinning with all 3 eyes crinkled in amusement. Now I think the Council was wise to be thorough, Threx said. Better to end a threat completely than to leave any doubt behind. A wounded animal can still bite. A dead one cannot. They are not dead yet, Vexilon said softly, his masked voice carrying an odd note that might have been caution, though it was hard to tell through the modulation. Merely broken. There is still the matter of full occupation, full surrender ceremonies, the formal transfer of what remains of their government structures. These things take time, even after a victory. A formality, Dorun said dismissively. We have crushed their fleet, their orbital defenses, their cities. What is left to resist with? A few hidden radios and some stubborn pride? Let them keep their pride. It changes nothing. I agree, Threx said. Within the week, we will begin bringing down the colony ships. Within the month, the first settlements will be established. Within the year, this planet will belong fully to the Dominion, and the species that called itself human will exist only as a labor class, learning to serve those who conquered them, the same as every other species we have brought under our banner. He raised his cup again. To House Valor, House Ka, House Thes, House Kez, and House Moth. To victory. To victory, the others echoed, and 5 cups were raised in 5 different rooms, across a distance that suddenly, without any of them realizing it, was about to become very small indeed. It was at that exact moment that every sensor board on all 5 motherships began, almost in unison, to scream. On the iron verdict, Pris the sensor officer nearly fell out of his chair, as dozens of new readouts flooded his console, faster than he could process them. Not dozens, hundreds, then thousands. "Captain," he shouted, all pretense of calm gone from his voice. "Multiple contacts, emerging from cloak across every quadrant. I am reading." He stopped, staring at the number in disbelief. "I am reading over 3,000 vessels, Captain. They are converging on our position from every direction, from the outer system, from beneath the ocean, from behind the moon." Sorenth Ka's three eyes went wide, his cup of ceremonial drink slipping from his hand and shattering on the deck. Across the other four ships, the same panic was breaking out in the same instant, sensor officers shouting warnings, alarms blaring red through corridors that moments ago had echoed with laughter and toasts to victory. Threx Valor stood so fast his chair toppled backward, staring at his own tactical display as it filled, in a matter of seconds, with more hostile contacts than he had seen in 40 years of military service combined. "That is impossible," he whispered, staring at the numbers. "That is not possible. Their fleet was destroyed. We destroyed it. We watched it burn." But the numbers on the screen did not care what he believed. They simply kept climbing, ship after ship after ship, rising from the ocean, dropping in from behind the moon, sweeping in from the outer planets, all of them moving with terrible, coordinated purpose toward 5 motherships that, only a moment ago, had believed themselves standing at the center of an already finished war. The 5 captains who had gathered to celebrate the fall of Earth stared at their screens in stunned, growing horror, as the true face of the enemy they had underestimated finally, after 40 long days, began to reveal itself. To understand why this moment struck the 5 captains so hard, it helps to understand what each of them had built their careers on. Threx Valor had risen through the ranks of House Valor by being methodical, by never once launching a campaign without exhaustive scouting and preparation. 40 successful conquests had taught him that surprises belonged to the side that failed to plan properly, and he had always been the side that planned. To be surprised now, after weeks of careful observation, felt less like bad luck, and more like a wound, to something he had believed was a core part of who he was. Sorenth Ka had built his reputation on decisiveness, on being the captain who acted first, and let others catch up. His 3 eyes had always given him an advantage other species lacked, a wider field of vision that had saved his ships more than once in tight engagements. But no number of eyes could see through a cloaking field built specifically to defeat his exact sensor arrays, and for the first time in his career, Sorenth found himself completely blind to a threat until it was already at his door. Ulara Thess prided herself above all else on logic, on being the captain who saw patterns others missed. It was this same instinct for pattern recognition that had made her uneasy about the strange readings near Mars, even when her fellow captains dismissed them. She was, in a strange way, the least surprised of the 5, because some quiet part of her analytical mind had already begun preparing for the possibility that something was wrong, even if she had not been able to name what it was in time to act on the feeling. Doru and Kez had spent 300 years being the immovable force in any battle, the captain whose ship simply absorbed punishment and kept coming forward. His confidence had never been built on cleverness so much as raw endurance, and it was this same stubborn endurance that would, in the coming minutes, make his ship's defeat both slower and more painful than it needed to be, because Dorun did not know how to stop fighting, even when fighting had already lost its purpose. Vex Elon Moth, hidden always behind his silver mask, had built a career on caution, on being the captain who asked the quiet questions no one else wanted to ask. It had made him unpopular among some of his peers, who found his constant caveats tiresome during moments of celebration. Now, watching the tactical display fill with thousands of hostile contacts, that same caution allowed him to process the disaster more quickly than his companions, because some part of him had never fully believed the celebration was premature. On the bridge of the Devourer of Light, Krev worked frantically to bring the ship's targeting systems back into some kind of order, sweat beading on his forehead despite the climate-controlled air. "Captain, I am attempting to establish shield priority protocols, but the sheer number of incoming contacts is overwhelming our processing capacity. I have never seen a tactical computer struggle this hard against a single engagement." "Focus on the nearest threats first," Threx ordered, forcing his voice into something resembling calm, even as his mind raced through options that seemed to shrink with every passing second. Full defensive posture. Signal the other captains, we regroup, back to back, and we hold until we understand what we are truly facing. Around him, the bridge crew of the Devourer of Light moved with the trained efficiency of soldiers who had served together through 40 previous campaigns, but efficiency alone could not manufacture time that did not exist. The human fleet was closing faster than any tactical model in the ship's database had predicted, for a species with Earth's known technology level, and somewhere in the back of Threx's mind, a cold and unwelcome thought began to take shape. Perhaps Earth's known technology level was no longer the technology level they were actually facing. Below, in the ocean depths, more ships continued to rise. The Deep Fleet's second wave broke the surface nearly a full minute after the first, giving the illusion from a distance that the fleet was still growing, even as its lead elements were already closing on their targets. A deliberate staggering of the launch sequence, designed specifically to maximize the psychological impact of the reveal. Admiral Cho's planning teams had spent months debating whether such a staggered approach was necessary, given that the tactical advantage of a single simultaneous launch might have been slightly greater. In the end, the psychological factor had won the argument. An enemy that watched wave after wave of ships emerge from a place they believed to be empty would spend precious seconds simply trying to process what they were seeing, seconds that could mean the difference between an organized defense and total confusion. It was working exactly as planned. Alarms tore through the Devourer of Light, red light washing over every corridor, every console, every stunned face on the bridge. Captain Threx Valor stood frozen for only a second, but a second was a long time for a commander who had spent 40 years learning never to freeze at all. He forced himself to move, snapping orders before his mind had even finished catching up with what his eyes were showing him. Full shields. All weapon batteries to ready status. I want a real count, not an estimate. How many ships are we facing? His tactical officer, a wiry alien named Krev, worked frantically at his station, fingers flying across controls that had never before needed to process this much incoming data at once. 3,100 confirmed, Captain, and the number is still climbing. They are converging from the outer solar system, from behind the moon, and, Krev's voice cracked slightly, from directly beneath us, from the ocean itself. The ocean, Threx repeated, disbelief thick in his voice. We scanned that ocean 100 times. There was nothing there. There was something there, Krev said. Something built to hide from exactly the kind of scans we were running. Captain, whatever this is, it was built specifically to be invisible to our sensors. This was not luck. This was planned. On the holographic display connecting all 5 captains, panic had replaced the earlier laughter entirely. Sorenth Ka's 3 eyes darted rapidly between different readouts on his own bridge, his earlier confidence completely gone. Threx, my sensors say the same thing. Thousands of contacts, converging fast, and my officers cannot get a clean read on their weapon capabilities. The cloaking technology alone is beyond anything we cataloged from this species. This is not possible, Dorun Kez growled, his battle-scarred face twisted with something between fury and disbelief. We crushed their fleet. I watched the Atlas Guard burn with my own sensors. There was nothing left. Apparently, Yulara Thess said, her voice tight and controlled despite the chaos around her. There was a second fleet, one we never detected, one built, it seems, specifically so that we would never detect it until it was far too late to matter. Vexilon Moth said nothing for a moment, his masked face turned toward his own tactical display, studying the approaching wall of green contacts with what might have been the alien equivalent of grudging respect, buried somewhere beneath the shock. They let us win, he said quietly. They let us believe we had already won, so that we would gather here, together, comfortable, unprepared. This entire war, the version of it we believed we were fighting, was a performance, staged for our benefit. Enough philosophy, Threx snapped, though the sharpness in his voice was as much fear as anger. All ships, break formation immediately. I want defensive spacing, full power to shields, and someone get me a clean tactical picture before... He never finished the sentence. The lead elements of the human fleet arrived at optimal firing range at the exact same moment across all 5 Coth positions, a level of coordination that would have been difficult even for ships that had trained together for years, let alone for a fleet built in secret from dozens of formerly rival nations. But 2 years of joint drills, conducted deep underground and far out in the solar system, away from any eyes that might report back to the enemy, had built something the Coth Dominion had never accounted for, a human military force that had learned, at last, to move as one. The Resolute led the charge from beneath the ocean, rising out of the waves in a curtain of white spray, its weapon systems already charged and locked before it had even fully cleared the water. Fleet Commander Okafor watched the tactical display fill with targeting solutions, dozens of them, hundreds, as every human ship in range found its mark on the 5 stunned motherships above. Multi-vector focus fire, all ships, target the flagship first, Okafor ordered, his voice calm in the way that only comes from years of imagining this exact moment, running it over and over in simulations until the real thing felt almost familiar. Concentrate on the devourer of light. Take the head off the snake before it can coordinate a response. Weapons locked, Voss confirmed. All batteries report firing solution ready. Fire. Space around the 5 motherships erupted into light. Thousands of human weapon batteries, built using technology reverse-engineered from a single captured Coth scout ship, and then improved far beyond the original design by human engineers who refused to simply copy what they found, unleashed their first true volley of the war. The Devourer of Light's shields, the strongest of any ship in the Coth fleet, absorbed the initial impact, flaring bright blue-white across its massive hull, but the sheer volume of incoming fire was staggering, more concentrated firepower than the ship had ever faced in its long service history. Shields at 71% and falling, Krev shouted over the alarms. Captain, we cannot hold this position. We need to disperse the formation now. Do it, Threx snarled, gripping the edge of his command console so hard his knuckles paled. All ships, break and scatter, independent evasive maneuvers, return fire on any target of opportunity. But scattering was easier ordered than done. The human fleet had not simply attacked, it had surrounded. Formation Sunrise, the plan Okafor and Cho had spent months refining, was built exactly for this scenario. A full envelopment, human ships positioned not just above and below the enemy formation, but on every conceivable vector of escape, a net drawn tight before the prey even realized it had been caught. On the Iron Verdict, Captain Sorenth Ka watched his own shields drop under a fresh wave of incoming fire. His earlier laughter, now a distant, almost unreal memory. Return fire. All batteries, full spread, he bellowed, and his ship's weapons answered, lancing bright beams of energy out into the swarm of human vessels. Some of those beams found their marks. A handful of human ships, caught in the opening seconds of the battle, before their own shields had reached full strength, took damage. A few destroyed outright in flashes of light that vanished as quickly as they appeared. It was not a one-sided slaughter. The Coth Dominion had not survived 40 conquests by being weak, and their weapons, even under panic, were still deadly. But it was not the battle they had expected either. They had expected, if they expected any resistance at all in this moment of celebration, perhaps a handful of surviving human ships, weak and desperate, easily swatted aside. What they faced instead was a fleet built with purpose, trained with discipline, and armed with 2 years of quiet, furious innovation. Captain, Krev's voice cracked with something close to panic now, a sound Threx had never heard from his steady tactical officer in 15 years of service together. Their weapons, the damage patterns are not consistent with anything in our threat database. Their shield frequencies are also unfamiliar. Our targeting computers cannot get a clean lock. Explain, Threx demanded, even as another impact rocked the bridge, throwing sparks from a damaged console nearby. They are not using our technology, Captain, Krev said. They studied it, yes, from whatever scout ship we lost early in the invasion, but what they built from it is different, better calibrated for this. It is as if, he struggled for the right words, as another explosion rattled the deck beneath their feet. It is as if they built weapons, specifically designed to counter our exact defensive systems. They knew precisely what we would bring, Captain, because they had 2 years to study everything we sent ahead as scouts and study every piece of equipment we ever lost to them. On the other 4 motherships, similar scenes were unfolding. Ulara Thess, always the coldest and most calculating of the 5 captains, was the first to fully grasp the scale of what was happening, watching her own tactical display, with an expression that had shifted from disbelief to something closer to grim respect. "They studied us," she said quietly, to no one in particular, her long fingers finally still against her console. "For 2 years, while we believed we were slowly grinding down a broken, defeated species, they were studying every mistake we made, every piece of technology we lost, every weakness we revealed. This was never a war we were winning. This was a test they were running on us, and we failed to notice we were being tested at all. Ulara, less analysis, more firing solutions." Threx's voice cut across the shared channel, sharp with strain. "All captains, we need to consolidate our formations, back to back, mutual shield support, immediately." It was sound tactical advice, the kind that had saved Coth fleets in dozens of previous engagements across the galaxy. But sound tactics require time to execute, and time was the one resource none of the 5 captains had left. The human fleet pressed its advantage with a speed and coordination that gave the Coth ships no room to regroup, no pause in which to catch their breath and organize a proper defense. Dorun Kez, aboard the Black Tide, found himself facing the heaviest concentration of human firepower of any of the 5 ships, his vessel positioned closest to the ocean surface where the deep fleet had first emerged. His shields, already weakened from the opening volley, began to fail in earnest, section by section, each failure marked by a fresh alarm shrieking through his bridge. "Captain, hull breach on decks 14 through 19. One of his officers shouted. "We are losing atmospheric integrity across a third of the ship." Dorun, a veteran of 3 centuries of warfare, felt something he had not felt in longer than he could remember. Genuine, cold fear. He had faced desperate last stands before, had crushed the final resistance of dozens of dying civilizations, had always been the hammer, never the anvil. He did not know, in this moment, how to be the anvil. "Evasive action, full reverse thrust, get us clear of their firing line," he ordered. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see on his tactical display that there was no clear line to retreat to. The human fleet had positioned itself too well, too completely, leaving no gap wide enough for a ship the size of the Black Tide to slip through cleanly. Above the chaos, on the flagship Devourer of Light, Captain Threx Valor stared at the battle unfolding around him, and, for the first time since he had taken command of his own vessel decades ago, felt the true weight of a mistake he could not yet fully calculate. He had believed, as all 5 captains had believed, that Earth was a conquered world, its people broken, its resistance nothing more than scattered whispers in the dark. He was beginning to understand, watching his shields fail and his allies scramble in disarray around him, that the whispers he had dismissed so easily had never been the sound of a dying species. They had been the sound of a species holding its breath, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Down on the surface of the planet, in shelters and bunkers scattered across every continent, people who had spent 40 days believing their world was ending, watched the sky through whatever cameras and sensors still functioned, and slowly, disbelief gave way to something they had not allowed themselves to feel in a long time. Hope. In a shelter beneath what had once been a busy street in Chicago, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair sat before a bank of monitors that had, until minutes ago, shown nothing but static and the occasional grim update from what remained of local authorities. She had worked as a systems engineer before the invasion, one of thousands of civilian specialists quietly recruited into support roles for the Continuity Council, without ever being told the full scope of what they were building toward. She had spent 2 years helping calibrate communication relays for a program she understood only in fragments, trusting the people above her that the fragments would someday add up to something worth the sacrifice. Now, watching the feed from a repurposed weather satellite that had somehow survived the initial invasion, she saw thousands of small lights rising from the ocean and converging on the alien fleet, and she began, quietly at first, and then without any attempt to hide it, to cry. Beside her, an old man who had once been a school teacher and was now simply one of many volunteers helping keep the shelter's systems running, placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Is that them?" he asked. "Is that our fleet?" "That's our fleet," Priya said, wiping her eyes and laughing despite herself, a sound that had not echoed through that shelter in a very long time. "That's really our fleet." Word spread through the shelter in minutes. passed from person to person in hushed, urgent tones, and soon a small crowd had gathered around the bank of monitors, watching in near silence as the battle above the Pacific unfolded in grainy, distant footage. No one cheered loudly, not yet, not while the outcome remained uncertain. But something in the room had shifted, a tightness in dozens of chests easing slightly, for the first time since the invasion began. Similar scenes played out in shelters across the world, wherever surviving communication networks allowed people to catch even fragments of what was happening far above them. 2 years of secrecy, 2 years of watching their own cities fall, without understanding why help never seemed to come, had taken a toll that would not disappear overnight. But in this moment, watching the sky fill with human ships instead of alien ones, something like faith began, cautiously, to return. Back in orbit, the battle raged on with an intensity that neither side had fully anticipated. Human ships, though individually smaller than their Coth counterparts, made up for the difference in size through sheer coordination, weaving between the larger alien vessels in patterns too complex for the Dominion's targeting computers to fully predict. It was a style of warfare built specifically to counter an enemy that valued raw power over maneuverability, developed over hundreds of simulated engagements run against captured Coth technology. Captain, the Silent Reaper is attempting to reposition, likely seeking a more defensible formation, Krev reported from his station aboard the Devourer of Light. Captain Thess appears to be the only one of the other commanders maintaining any real tactical discipline. Then and she may be the only one of them worth learning from, before this is over, Threx muttered, watching his own shields continue to bleed away, under the relentless, coordinated fire of the human fleet. He thought, briefly and bitterly, of the toast he had raised such a short time ago, of the confident words about a new age for the Dominion. Those words felt impossibly distant now, spoken by a version of himself who had not yet understood what kind of enemy he was truly facing. The battle above the Pacific Ocean had become something no simulation on either side had fully predicted. On the human side, months of drills had prepared Fleet Commander Okafor for many outcomes, but even he found himself slightly amazed at how quickly the 5 Coth motherships, so confident only minutes before, had been thrown into disarray. Iron Verdict is breaking formation, Voss reported from her station, watching the enemy flagship's nearest ally peel away from the main cluster. It looks like Captain Ka is trying to run. Let him try, Okafor said. Cut off his escape vectors. I want the Vigilant Squadron on his tail before he clears the debris field. Aboard the Iron Verdict, Sorenth Ka had reached a decision any experienced commander would understand, even if it was not one that would look good in any official report. His ship was taking damage faster than his engineers could repair it. His shields were down to less than a third of their normal strength, and the tactical picture on his display showed no realistic path to victory, only a choice between fighting until his ship was destroyed, or trying to escape, while escape was still theoretically possible. All power to the engines, he ordered. We break for open space, now, while there is still a gap to use. Captain, House Valor will call this desertion, his second-in-command warned, a note of genuine fear in her voice. Fear not of the battle, but of what would happen if they survived it, and had to explain their actions to the Dominion Council. House Valor can call it whatever it likes, so long as we are alive to hear the accusation, Sorenth snapped back. A dead captain defends no one, explains nothing, and serves no purpose to the Dominion at all. Now move this ship. The Iron Verdict surged forward, its remaining shield power diverted entirely to its forward arc, aiming for a gap in the human formation that Sorenth's tactical officer had identified moments before. For a few tense seconds, it looked as though the maneuver might actually work, the massive ship accelerating faster than most of the smaller human vessels could easily track. Then the Vigilant Squadron arrived. 12 human ships, smaller and faster than anything in the main battle line, had been held in reserve specifically for this purpose, hunting down any Coth vessel that attempted to flee the main engagement. They closed on the Iron Verdict from 3 directions at once, their weapons designed with a very particular purpose in mind. Not to destroy a fleeing enemy outright, but to disable its engines and force a surrender. Engine section taking direct hits, Sorenth's engineer shouted. We are losing propulsion, Captain. I cannot maintain our current speed. The Iron Verdict shuddered violently, as its main engines flared and then dimmed, the ship slowing rapidly from its escape speed to a near standstill, drifting now rather than flying, an easy target for any human ship that wished to finish the job. Sorenth stared at his display, watching the 12 smaller ships surround his crippled vessel, weapons still charged and ready, and understood with a cold, sinking certainty that his attempt at escape had only guaranteed his capture rather than his death. A channel opened on his own bridge, uninvited, a human voice speaking through his ship's translator systems in a tone that was calm, almost polite, and somehow far more unsettling than any battle cry would have been. Coth vessel, this is Lieutenant Commander Reyes, of the Vigilant Squadron. Your engines are disabled, and you are surrounded. Power down your weapons, and prepare to be boarded, or we will finish what we started. The choice, and I mean this sincerely, is entirely yours. Sorenth Ka, who had conquered 3 worlds in his career, and had never once considered the possibility of surrendering to anyone, sat frozen in his command chair for a long moment, his 3 eyes fixed on the human voice's calm, steady tone. There was no gloating in it, no cruelty, nothing like the mockery he and his fellow captains had shown Earth only minutes before. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered without malice, which somehow made it far harder to argue with. Power down weapons, he said quietly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Signal surrender. Elsewhere in the battle, matters were proceeding no better for the other captains. Doru and Kez, aboard the badly damaged Black Tide, had abandoned any pretense of an organized retreat and was instead fighting with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, throwing every remaining weapon system into a continuous barrage aimed at the nearest human ships, determined to take as many of the enemy with him as his failing vessel could manage. It was, in its own brutal way, an impressive last stand from a warrior who had never once in 300 years faced true defeat. It was not enough. Black Tide's shields are gone, Voss reported to Okafor. Their weapon systems are failing across multiple decks. They're still firing, but it's uncoordinated now, more instinct than strategy. Give them the chance to stand down, Okafor said. Same offer as the others. We are not here for a slaughter. The offer was transmitted, the same calm words spoken to Dorun Kez that had been spoken to Sorenth Ka only minutes before. Dorun's reply, when it came, was a wordless roar of defiance, broadcast across the open channel, followed by another desperate volley of weapons fire that did little more than scorch the shields of the nearest human cruiser. He's not listening, Voss said. Then we make the decision for him, Okafor replied, his voice heavy but resolute. Target his remaining weapon batteries and engine core only. Disable, don't destroy, if we can help it. He's earned that much respect, even now. Precise, concentrated fire tore through the Black Tide's remaining defenses, silencing its weapons one by one, section by section, until the great ship hung dark and powerless in space, its engines dead, its captain slumped in his command chair, breathing hard, staring at a battle he had lost more completely than he had ever imagined possible. On the Silent Reaper, Captain Ulara Thess had approached the crisis very differently from her 2 allies. Rather than attempting to flee or fighting to the last breath, she had spent the opening minutes of the battle doing what she did best, calculating. She watched the tactical display with cold, careful attention, noting the precise patterns of the human fleet's attacks, the coordination between their squadrons, the disciplined restraint they showed even in victory, offering surrender rather than simply annihilating crippled enemy ships. They are not fighting like conquerors, she said quietly to her bridge crew, more thinking aloud than truly addressing anyone. They are fighting like a species that has learned, very recently and very painfully, exactly what a war without mercy costs. They want this to end. They do not want to become what we tried to make of them. Her tactical officer glanced at her, confused. Captain, orders? Ulara considered the numbers on her display one final time. Her shields were down to 40%, her weapons still largely functional, but the mathematics of the situation were clear to her sharp mind, in a way that pure emotion might have obscured for a less disciplined commander. Continued resistance offered no realistic path to victory, only a slower, more painful version of the same defeat Sorenth and Dorun had already suffered. Power down weapons, she said. Open a channel. We will negotiate terms, not beg for mercy. There is a difference, and I intend for the Dominion Council to understand which one this was. Her surrender, delivered with the same cold precision she brought to everything else, was accepted without incident. Her ship allowed to power down safely under close human escort. Her crew treated, to her genuine surprise, with a level of professional courtesy she had not expected from a species she had spent weeks mocking as primitive and emotional. On the hollow choir, Captain Vexilon Moth watched the collapse of his fellow captain's defenses with the strange, quiet detachment that had always characterized him among his peers. He had said very little during the earlier celebration, had offered the most cautious assessments of the 5 captains, and now, watching the battle unfold exactly as his instincts had quietly warned him it might, he found himself facing a decision that required no great deliberation at all. "Cease all offensive action," he told his crew, his modulated voice as calm in defeat as it had been in victory. "There is no honor in a battle already lost, only foolishness in refusing to see it clearly." His crew, trained under a captain who valued clear thinking over blind aggression, complied without argument, and the hollow choir became the third of the 5 ships to power down its weapons and accept the terms of surrender offered by the human fleet. That left only the Devourer of Light and Captain Threx Valor, still fighting, still refusing to accept what every readout on his bridge was telling him, with increasing, undeniable clarity. "Captain," Krev said, his voice hoarse from shouting over the alarms for the better part of 20 minutes. "3 of the other ships have surrendered. The Black Tide is disabled and drifting. We are the last ones still engaged, and our shields are failing across every section. We cannot continue this fight." Threx Valor stood at the center of his ruined bridge, sparks falling from damaged consoles around him, the acrid smell of burning circuitry thick in the recycled air, and stared at the tactical display showing his once proud fleet reduced to wreckage and surrender in less than half an hour. 40 years of service. 41 worlds, he had believed, brought under Dominion control. And here, above a planet he had mocked as weak and broken only minutes before, his career, his fleet, and everything he had believed about the species called humanity, was collapsing around him in real time. "There has to be another option," he said, more to himself than to anyone listening. "There has to be something we have not tried." "Captain," Krev said gently, in the tone of a man who had served this commander loyally for 15 years and did not wish to see him die for pride alone, "there is one option left. The same one our allies have already chosen." Threx closed his eyes for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling over him like a physical thing. He thought of the toast he had raised only half an hour ago, the confident words about the fall of Earth and the beginning of a new age for the Dominion. He thought of the mocking laughter that had filled 5 separate command decks as they discussed a species they believed was already beaten. He opened his eyes and looked at the tactical display one final time, at the human fleet surrounding his ship on every side, patient, disciplined, and utterly unwilling to be underestimated ever again. "Power down weapons," he said quietly. "Signal surrender." The battle above the Pacific Ocean, which had begun with laughter and boasting, and had ended in less than 35 minutes with the complete defeat of 5 alien command fleets, finally fell silent. The final minutes of the engagement had unfolded with a strange, almost formal quality, each surrender following a similar pattern, weapons powering down, a brief exchange of terms, and then the slow, careful process of human boarding parties preparing to secure 5 ships that, less than an hour earlier, had represented the greatest military threat Earth had ever faced. Aboard the Resolute, Fleet Commander Okafor allowed himself a long moment to simply watch the tactical display. 5 red markers, now shown as disabled rather than hostile, surrounded by a fleet that had, against every reasonable expectation from 2 years ago, accomplished exactly what it had been built to accomplish. "Casualties?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the number would matter to him more than any celebration. 41 ships lost across the full engagement, Voss reported, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone determined not to let emotion crack through until the job was finished. 116 damaged, several severely. Full casualty reports will take time, but early estimates suggest losses far below our worst-case projections. "Far below is still not zero," Okafor said, and Voss said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. He had lost people today. Real people, with families and histories. People who had spent 2 years training in secret for a battle they could not tell anyone about, not even the loved ones who wondered why they were away from home so often. Their sacrifice had bought a victory that would be remembered for generations, but it had still been a sacrifice, and Okafor intended to carry that weight honestly, rather than letting it disappear beneath the noise of celebration. On the ground, as word of the fleet's success spread through what remained of Earth's communication networks, the reaction was not immediate. Unified jubilation, so much as a slow, cautious unclenching, city by city, shelter by shelter, as people who had spent 40 days believing the worst had already happened, began to understand that it had not. In the Chicago shelter where Dr. Priya Nair had watched the opening minutes of the battle, the mood had shifted from disbelief to quiet, tearful relief, as reports confirmed that all 5 Coth command ships had been disabled or had surrendered. Someone found an old radio and managed to tune it to one of the few remaining broadcast stations still operating, and for the first time in over a month, actual news, rather than static or emergency instructions, crackled through the shelter's speakers. "This is not the end of everything," Priya said to the small crowd still gathered around her monitors, her voice hoarse but steady. "There will be a lot of rebuilding, a lot of grief, for everyone we lost these past 40 days. But we're still here. We're still human. And apparently, we're a lot more stubborn than anyone up there expected." A ragged cheer went up through the shelter, quiet at first, then louder, spreading from room to room as the news continued to travel. It was not the triumphant celebration of a war fully won. There was too much loss behind them, and too much uncertainty ahead for that. But it was, for the first time since the invasion began, a sound of genuine hope rather than desperate endurance. Above the Pacific, as boarding operations continued through the following hours, Threk's valor stood in the ruins of his own bridge, and watched human soldiers move carefully through his ship, securing weapon systems with a professionalism that struck him, even in his defeat, as somewhat unexpected. He had prepared himself, in the moments before his surrender, for the possibility of cruelty, of the kind of harsh treatment his own forces had sometimes shown to defeated enemies on other worlds. What he found instead was a strange, disciplined restraint that left him with more questions about this species than he had carried into the battle in the first place. "You fought well," he said quietly, to the young human officer, overseeing the securing of his bridge, the words costing him something he could not quite name. "Better than we expected." The officer, a woman perhaps a third of his own age, looked at him with an expression that held no triumph, only tired professionalism. "We had 2 years to get ready," she said simply. "You had 40 days to think you'd already won. I imagine that made a difference." Threk said nothing further, but the words stayed with him, long after the officer had moved on to her next task, a small, uncomfortable seed of understanding, taking root in a mind that had spent 40 years believing it understood exactly what conquest required. Silence settled over the Pacific Ocean in a way it had not known in 40 days. 5 great motherships hung dark and powerless in the sky, their weapons cold, their engines still, surrounded on every side by the disciplined ships of a fleet the Coth Dominion had never known existed, until it was far too late to matter. Below, in cities across the darkened world, people who had spent 40 days hiding in shelters and basements and underground stations began, slowly and cautiously, to notice something strange happening in the sky above them. The alien ships had stopped moving. In Bastion Deep, 12 kilometers beneath the surface of what had once been called Nevada, Admiral Elena Cho watched the final confirmation come through on the main display. All 5 Coth command vessels, disabled or surrendered. Total human losses, 41 ships destroyed, 116 damaged, casualties still being counted but far, far lower than the worst projections her planning teams had prepared her for. She allowed herself a long breath, the first truly easy breath she had taken, in longer than she could remember. "General Webb," she said, turning to the man beside her, whose scarred jaw was set in an expression somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "It's done." "It's done," he repeated, as if testing the words, making sure they were real. 40 days of watching them burn our cities, and it's done in 35 minutes. 2 years of preparation bought those 35 minutes, Elena said quietly. Never forget that. This victory did not happen today. It happened every single day for 2 years, in every hidden shipyard, every joint training exercise, every argument between nations who finally learned to trust each other enough to build something bigger than any one of them could build alone. Above the ocean, aboard the Resolute, Fleet Commander Okafor stood on his bridge and watched the 5 captured Coth vessels through the view screen, their once imposing silhouettes now dark and silent against the stars. Boarding parties were already preparing to move across, careful and professional, following protocols developed over months of planning for exactly this moment. "Commander," Voss said, "Admiral Cho is requesting a direct channel. She wants to speak with the enemy captains personally." "Patch her through," Okafor said. A new hologram appeared on the bridge, Elena Cho's calm, steady face replacing the tactical display for a moment. Across 5 separate channels, opened simultaneously to all 5 surrendered Coth vessels, her voice carried clearly, translated instantly by systems built specifically to communicate with the Dominion's language. "This is Admiral Elena Cho, of the United Earth Fleet," she said. "You are addressing the survivors of a species you called weak, broken, and defeated only an hour ago. I want to be very clear about what happens next, because I do not believe in unnecessary cruelty, and I do not believe in unnecessary confusion either." On the Devourer of Light, Captain Threx Valor listened in silence, his amber eyes dim with exhaustion, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine humility, an emotion he had rarely if ever felt in 40 years of service. "Your ships and crews will be held under the terms of formal surrender, as recognized by the conventions your own Dominion Council claims to honor," Elena continued. "Your crews will not be harmed, so long as they cooperate with our boarding teams. You will be given the opportunity to communicate with your council, under our supervision, to explain the terms of what has happened here today. What you tell them is your own affair. What I would ask you to remember, when you do speak with them, is this. Earth did not win today, because we are naturally stronger than your Dominion. We won because we learned, and because we planned, and because for the first time in a very long time, every nation on this planet decided that surviving together mattered more than winning separately." She paused, letting the words settle across 5 silent bridges. "You mocked us for taking so long to unite," she said. "You were not wrong that it took us too long. But we did unite, in the end. And that is a lesson your Dominion would be wise to remember, before it sends another fleet to a world it has not fully understood." On the Silent Reaper, Captain Yulara Thess found herself, despite everything, nodding slowly at the words, recognizing in them the same cold clarity she valued in her own thinking. On the Hollow Choir, Vexilon Moth said nothing, but something in his posture suggested he, too, understood exactly how thoroughly his species had misjudged this small, stubborn blue-green world. Doru and Kez, aboard the crippled Black Tide, said nothing at all, staring instead at the wreckage of his own bridge, the 300 years of unbroken victories that had defined his career, now ending in a single afternoon he would never fully live down. And Sorenth Ka, aboard the disabled Iron Verdict, found himself thinking not of his own defeat, but of the strange, quiet dignity in the human voice that had offered him surrender rather than annihilation, a kindness he was not certain his own Dominion would have extended in the same circumstance. The boarding operations proceeded over the following hours with careful, disciplined precision. Human teams moved through the captured ships, securing weapons, treating wounded crew members regardless of species, cataloging technology that would prove invaluable in understanding the wider Coth Dominion, beyond the 5 ships that had come to conquer Earth. There was no gloating among the human soldiers, no mockery returned in kind for the mockery given. Admiral Cho had been clear on that point during the 2 years of planning. Victory earned through discipline should be honored with the same discipline, not squandered in cruelty that would only breed a deeper, more dangerous enemy in the future. 3 days later, in a conference chamber, built specifically for this purpose deep within Bastion Deep, Admiral Cho sat across a long table from a holographic representation of the Coth Dominion Council, 5 distant figures who had received, with clear and visible shock, the reports of what had happened to their 41st conquest attempt. "You claim," said the lead council member, an ancient and heavily augmented alien, whose voice carried the weight of decades spent overseeing conquest after conquest, "that your species allowed our forces to believe they had won, deliberately, in order to draw our command fleet into a trap." "That is correct," Elena said simply. "Your own soldiers died in that deception, thousands of them, by our own scans of the early engagement." "They did," Elena said, and for a moment, something heavy and sorrowful passed across her steady expression. before she mastered it again. They died defending their homes without knowing the full plan, because the plan required their sacrifice to look real, and we owed them the truth of that decision, even if we could not give them the truth of the plan itself in the moment. We do not take that cost lightly, counselor. We will carry it for a very long time. But we made a choice, as a species, to survive rather than to fight fair against an enemy that gave us no reason to expect fairness in return. The council member was silent for a long moment, processing this with whatever passed for careful consideration among his kind. "And what do you intend to do with our 5 captains and their crews?" "Return them," Elena said. "Once formal terms are agreed upon, Earth has no interest in becoming what the Dominion has been to 40 other worlds. We do not want prisoners. We do not want conquered territory beyond our own solar system. And we do not want endless war. What we want is simple. We want the Dominion Council to understand, clearly and permanently, that this world is no longer available for conquest, by your forces or by anyone else who might be watching this outcome with interest of their own." Far across the galaxy, in systems the Coth Dominion had never imagined paying close attention to a species as young as humanity, that message did indeed spread, carried by trade routes and diplomatic channels between dozens of species who had, for centuries, watched the Dominion expand unchecked. A young world, barely out of its own infancy in the eyes of the wider galaxy, had faced 5 full command fleets, and had not simply survived, but had turned the tables so completely that the very captains who came to conquer it were forced to negotiate for their own crew's safe return. Back on Earth, in the weeks that followed, humanity began the long, difficult work of rebuilding what the invasion had destroyed. Cities that had gone dark slowly came back to life. Governments that had operated in fragmented secrecy for 2 years began, carefully and imperfectly, to knit themselves back into something resembling normal function, though changed permanently by what they had all been through together. Admiral Elena Cho stood one evening on the surface, in a city slowly rebuilding its power grid, and looked up at a clear night sky free, for the first time in 40 days, of alien warships. General Webb stood beside her, his scarred face turned upward as well. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked quietly. "The Dominion, or something else like them." "Maybe," Elena said. "The galaxy is a big place, and we've just proven ourselves worth noticing, for better or worse. But we're not the same planet we were 2 years ago. We know how to build together now. We know what we can do when we stop fighting each other long enough to fight for each other instead." 41 worlds, Webb said, thinking of the number the captured captains had mentioned, the long list of conquests behind House Valor and its allies, all of them beaten before we were, all of them still under Dominion control, still living the way we almost had to live. Elena nodded slowly, understanding exactly where his thoughts had gone, because her own thoughts had gone to the same place more than once in the quiet hours after the battle. "That's a problem for another day," she said. "Today, we rebuild. Tomorrow, maybe, we think about what it means that we're not the only ones out there who might need saving." Above them, the stars turned slowly in their old, patient patterns, indifferent to the small, stubborn planet below that had just taught 5 very confident captains an unforgettable lesson, that a quiet species, given enough time and enough reason to unite, could turn even its own defeat into the trap that broke its enemies for good. Humanity had not simply survived the invasion, it had answered it, decisively, and the story of that answer would be told for generations to come, in every corner of a world that had finally, after so much loss, remembered what it meant to stand together. In the months that followed, the story of the battle above the Pacific spread far beyond Earth's own borders, carried by the 5 surrendered captains and their crews back to the wider galaxy, and by the trade networks and diplomatic channels that connected dozens of species who had, for a long time, treated the Coth Dominion's expansion as simply the way things were. A young world, one that most of the galaxy had never bothered to learn the name of, had done something no other conquered world had managed in living memory. It had turned defeat into deception, and deception into victory, without losing the discipline to show mercy once that victory was won. Captain Sorenth Ka, released along with his crew, under the terms negotiated between Earth and the Dominion Council, carried the memory of his defeat differently than he expected to. He had assumed, in the dark hours after his surrender, that shame would define how he remembered this campaign for the rest of his career. Instead, he found himself telling the story to younger officers with something closer to respect than bitterness. A cautionary tale about the dangers of celebrating before a battle was truly finished. Captain Yulara Thess returned to Dominion space and used her account of the engagement to argue, quietly but persistently, for a fundamental reassessment of how the Council evaluated potential conquests. A species should not be measured only by the fleets it showed you, she argued in report after report, but by the possibility of the fleets it did not. Her arguments were not universally welcomed, but they were heard, and in the years that followed, more than one Dominion campaign was called off, after cautious scouting revealed patterns uncomfortably similar to what Earth had shown before the battle above the Pacific. Doru Nkez, the veteran of 3 centuries who had never before faced true defeat, struggled longer than his fellow captains to make peace with what had happened. It was not until nearly a year later, in a conversation with a younger officer, who had also survived the engagement, that he began to speak of the battle, without simply describing it as bad luck or an unfair trick. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to understand that the humans had not won through trickery alone, but through the same discipline and unity he had spent 300 years demanding from his own crews. It was a hard lesson for a proud warrior to learn, but he learned it, in his own time and in his own way. Vexilon Moth, who had suspected trouble before any of his fellow captains, wrote a private account of the battle that circulated quietly among a small number of Dominion officers who valued caution over bravado. His account became, over time, something close to required reading for any commander preparing to approach an unfamiliar world, a reminder that the quietest planets sometimes had the loudest surprises waiting beneath the surface. Threx Valor, once the most confident of the 5, carried his defeat the longest and the heaviest, precisely because he had been the one who led the celebration, who had raised the first toast to a victory that had not, in truth, ever really been theirs. He returned to Dominion space a changed commander, one who never again allowed a campaign to be declared finished until every possible variable had been accounted for, a lesson learned at a cost he would spend the rest of his career trying to justify. On Earth, the rebuilding continued, slow and uneven, marked by both remarkable progress and painful setbacks. Cities that had been destroyed in the opening days of the invasion took years to fully restore, and the scars of those 40 days, both physical and emotional, would remain visible for a long time to come. But something fundamental had changed in how the people of Earth saw themselves and each other. The old divisions, the old rivalries between nations that had once seemed as permanent as the oceans separating them, had not vanished entirely, but they had been softened, reshaped by the shared memory of what unity had made possible when it mattered most. A new organization emerged from the ashes of the old Continuity Council, one built openly this time rather than in secret, tasked with maintaining the fleet, the shared research programs, and the careful diplomatic relationships that would define humanity's place among the stars going forward. It was imperfect, as all human institutions tend to be, filled with disagreements and compromises and the ordinary messiness of people trying to work together across old boundaries. But it held, year after year, in a way that similar efforts before the invasion never quite had, because everyone involved remembered exactly what had been at stake the last time humanity failed to stand together in time. Years later, historians would debate many aspects of the invasion and the battle that ended it, the ethics of the deception, the cost paid by the Atlas Guard, and the forces that fought and died without knowing the larger plan, the long-term consequences of humanity's sudden, dramatic entrance onto the wider galactic stage. But on one point, nearly everyone eventually agreed. The story of 5 confident captains who mocked a broken, defeated Earth, only to watch a hidden human fleet rise from the ocean and the shadows of the outer solar system, to prove them catastrophically wrong, would be remembered as the moment humanity stopped being a species that simply survived, and became a species that the rest of the galaxy learned, however reluctantly, to respect.